thing about populism. I remember as an undergraduate and learning about populism, and it just sort of glazed over me, and I was not terribly interested. And then I got back to it in graduate school, and it's now utterly fascinating to me because it's this whole period of this incredible change and ferment. And as you point out so well, both in this talk and in your book, it becomes the root of so many of these ideas and discussions that then reshape American society in the 20th century, right? Between the progressive era and the Depression and New Deal, and ultimately parts of the civil rights movement, you can see echoes and threads woven, no pun intended with cotton, but woven between all of those different pieces that the world we live in so many ways, you can see a lot of those ideas in the late 19th century and what the farmers were talking about, the populists were talking about. The trick there for me is to get my students excited about that.
It's a challenge.
It is a challenge. So I'm going to ask you a couple of questions that I get a lot from my classes about the populists. One thing students always ask me is, why did they stick with cotton when cotton prices just kept like relentlessly marching into the floor? My students are like, well, why didn't they grow something else? And I'm like, well, I'll ask Dr. Cantrell.
Well, I think there are two answers to that question. First, force of habit is one thing. I mean, cotton had been king, right? In the South for decades. It had been the foundation of the country. It's what if you raised a cash crop in the 19th century South, the odds are that it was probably cotton. Cotton dwarfed other crops. And so that's, in some ways, that seems almost like a sort of cop-out idea that they didn't know anything else. But I think there's some truth to it. But I think the more important answer alongside that is the fact that this, when all was said and done, as bad as cotton was, it still paid better than almost any other crop. Certainly any other crop anybody knew how to grow or that would grow well in the South. I mean, when I sat down last week to work up this, I had slides on wheat, and I was going to talk a lot about wheat, and you can't do it all in 30 minutes, and cattle. But the real answer is that it was still better than wheat. And of course, wheat doesn't grow everywhere in Texas very well. I mean, you can grow it, but it really only grows really well in North Texas, North and Northwest Texas. But if I showed you the graph I had of wheat, it was at least as bad and probably worse than cotton. The other reason that so many farmers grew it is because I didn't really dwell on it, but you saw that the chart I had of the growth in farm tenancy. When you lose your farm and you have to make your living on a rented farm, and particularly if that is you're a sharecropper, you're paying your rent with a share of the crop, you don't control what crop you plant. Your landlord dictates to you what crop you will plant, and the landlord will very often dictate how much of that land gets planted in what crop. And the answer was invariably cotton, because again, it still paid better than other things. And you're going to plant every last square foot right up to the doorstep of your sharecropper shack. You're going to plant in cotton.
Right. Yeah, I always tell my students, if you're borrowing money as a farmer, you don't have much choice, just like you outlined. And cotton doesn't rot the way wheat can, and so it can be shelf stable for a long time as well. Yep. I would say it's not like they're going to open a shoe store, right? You're already behind. So it only takes a year of being behind to have no choice in the matter, because you can't control the situation if you can't borrow money, as you said at the beginning, for an entire year up front from somebody who isn't willing to finance that unless you're growing something they can make money on.
Right. And you could always leave the farm and go to town, right? But you hit Dallas, right, or Houston, penniless. Maybe you can find it. Maybe you can, sleep in an alleyway and find yourself one of those factory jobs where you're brutally exploited too, right? Yeah,
Yeah,
and that's
right.
not a very pleasant alternative either.
These are all bad choices. I always say it's the least bad option for some people. At least it
Yeah.
seems that way in the short term. But the people with almost in all cases very few resources to rely on to do anything different, and that's a tough spot to be in. I had a question from Taylor about we talk about the legacies of the populist movement in all these different directions, progressivism, the New Deal. But did that framework of what the populists were asking for, particularly more active government regulation of the economy, lay groundwork for Texans to join like the Socialist Party in the early 20th century?
Mhm. Well, in some cases, yes. Okay, after the People's Party fell apart in the few years right after 1896, old populists mostly did one of three things. A few of them, and we don't have good numbers, but I'd say it's less than 10%, probably based upon a sort of impressionistic look at voter turnout. Maybe 10% of them became socialist in the early years of the 20s. There are some elections in the 19 teens when the Socialist Party is the second most successful political party in Texas. That's how far the Republican Party had fallen into disrepute. But, first of all, socialism did have a bad name then, as it does now with many Americans. And socialism simply seemed too radical for many people. So I guess what I would say, the hardcore left wing of the Populist Party became the heart of the Socialist Party. But that was only the real hardcore fringe of the Populists. So that was one choice. The second choice was you could drop out of politics in disillusionment. And we know that many populists did that. Mm-hmm. Overall, for a bunch of complicated reasons, overall voter participation collapses in the years around the turn of the century and doesn't recover for decades. Okay.
That's Jim Crow.
Yeah, Jim Crow and disfranchisement had a lot to do with that too. And of course, it wasn't just Black and brown farmers who were the victims of that either, by the way.
Or whites.
It was a lot of these people who had voted populist are disqualified from voting by the institution of the poll tax in 1903. So there's that. Or your other real choice, and this is the choice that I'd say the most populist made, and that is you could grudgingly return to the Democratic Party, but support the progressive wing of that party. Okay, the Democratic Party, when it's the last man standing, the last political party standing after 1896, as parties in one-party systems almost always do, it was badly divided internally, right? Just because the Democratic Party was the only game in town didn't mean that all Democrats suddenly agreed with one another. So the old Jim Hogg wing of the party, the progressive wing of the party, sort of enjoys a rebirth right around the turn of the century. And it is reinvigorated by an infusion of old populist voters who reach a sort of rapprochement with their former political enemies in the Democratic Party. And these parties end up passing a pretty progressive agenda on economic matters. Again, they finally get the Railroad Commission reestablished, and finally it gets some real powers. For example, the Democratic Party eventually embraces woman suffrage, which many populists had supported, and regulation of food, pure food and drugs, and a lot of those kinds of things. And there's much more active state level enforcement of state antitrust laws after the turn of the century, and that's all made. And some fairly progressive Democratic governors are elected after the turn of the century. People like Governor Thomas Campbell and Governor Pat Neff and William Hobby and Ross Sterling and some others. So there's about a 20-year period from about 1908 to 1918 where or 10-year period, I should say, and really on into the 20s in some ways, where the progressive wing of the Democratic Party has sort of triumphed, and that became the political home of many old populists.
Yeah. Well, very good. Well, I've got a whole pile of questions, but I want to make sure we have time for your document.